This is the first month I won't be able to afford rent. I'm not a rich person. I don't have a lot of stuff. I have basic household necessities, a couch, a bed, washer, a dryer. That's about it. A car. I don't have a lot of lavish things. I don't go on vacations and I don't spend a lot. Rent's increased from $1,300 to $1,800. The food prices are too high. I've cut back on eating because I literally cannot afford food. I've cut back on my favorite snacks, cat food, treats. I'm exhausted all the time from being overworked and underpaid. You don't catch a break when you grow up poor. I don't need much to be happy. I just want to be able to live comfortable. I just really need to catch a break right now. I'm trying so hard and I feel like I'm not doing enough. I don't have family. I don't have anything to fall back.
Something serious is unfolding right now, and most people either cannot see it or refuse to look directly at it. What we are witnessing is not a small cultural shift or a temporary economic downturn, but a deep structural change that is quietly reshaping the lives of millions of women in ways they were never prepared for. What makes this moment so dangerous is that it is happening in plain sight, and yet the dominant narrative insists that everything is fine. If you stay with me until the end of this video, you are going to see how decades of choices, policies, and social conditioning have converged into a reality that very few are ready to confront. Before we go any further, take a moment to like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and if you want to get every single video the moment we release it. That support helps keep these conversations alive and visible in a time when honest discussion is increasingly discouraged. I also want you to check out Angry's Crypto Academy, which is linked in the description of this video. If you want to learn how to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth and learn how to buy, sell, and trade crypto with a long-term mindset, go check out Angry's Crypto Academy right now using the link below. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support directly, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. That support goes a long way in keeping the lights on and the message flowing. Now, let us talk about what is really happening. Something terrible is happening to women, and the most unsettling part is that many of them do not seem to realize it yet. Women across the modern world are sliding into poverty, desperation, and emotional collapse at rates that would have been unthinkable just a few generations ago. Jobs that once provided stability are disappearing, wages are failing to keep up with the cost of living, and the safety nets that women were told would always be there are fraying under pressure. At the same time, the social contract that once connected men and women has broken down, leaving many women isolated in a system that no longer works the way they were promised it would. For decades, women were told that independence meant freedom, that self-reliance meant security, and that replacing men with institutions would guarantee safety and stability. What they were not told is that systems do not care about individuals, and institutions do not provide loyalty, protection, or sacrifice in the way people do. As men gradually withdrew from social, romantic, and economic participation, women were left standing alone in a structure that was never designed to support them indefinitely. What we are seeing now is not empowerment, but exposure. There is a growing gap between the story women were sold and the reality they are living. Women were told that they could have everything: career, family, fulfillment, freedom, and security without trade-offs. They were told that biology could be negotiated with, that time could be ignored, and that responsibility could be deferred indefinitely. The result of that messaging is now visible everywhere in declining birth rates, rising mental health struggles, mounting debt, and increasing reliance on state support. These are not isolated problems, they are interconnected outcomes. For years, men were told that they were not needed, that they were replaceable, and that their traditional roles were obsolete or harmful. Men were told to step aside, to stop leading, to stop providing, and to stop protecting. Many men resisted at first, but eventually, a critical mass listened. They internalized the message, adjusted their behavior, and withdrew. They did not protest loudly, they did not riot, and they did not demand attention. They simply stopped participating. This withdrawal did not happen overnight. It happened slowly, quietly, and deliberately. Men stopped dating, men stopped marrying, men stopped mentoring, men stopped investing emotionally and financially in systems that openly framed them as liabilities. Men focused inward, simplified their lives, and learned to operate independently. And now, years later, the consequences of that shift are landing squarely on women who were never warned that this was possible. One of the most uncomfortable truths in this conversation is that many women believed that feminism liberated them, when in reality, it transferred dependency from men to the state and to corporations. Before modern feminism, most women did not need to work in order to survive. After it, working became mandatory, not optional. Two incomes became necessary just to maintain a basic standard of living, while housing, healthcare, and education costs exploded. The promise of choice quietly turned into obligation. Women were encouraged to delay family formation in favor of career development with the assurance that they could return to those goals later. What was left out of that message was the biological reality of fertility, pair bonding, and long term relationship dynamics. Time was treated as an infinite resource when it is not. As women aged out of their most fertile and socially advantageous years, many discovered that the options they assumed would always be available were no longer there. At the same time, men adapted to new social rules by becoming risk averse. Laws, workplace policies, and cultural norms increasingly framed male initiative as dangerous or inappropriate. Men learned that a misinterpreted interaction could carry serious consequences, while avoidance carried none. Over time, avoidance became the rational choice. The result was not greater harmony, but greater distance. In countries around the world, we are now seeing the same pattern emerge. Men are opting out of dating, opting out of marriage, and opting out of traditional social engagement. Entire industries built around male participation, bars, clubs, restaurants, dating platforms, and entertainment venues are struggling because the primary spenders have left. These spaces are increasingly populated by people waiting for something that no longer arrives. As men disengage, women are discovering that independence without support is not empowerment, but isolation. Many women are carrying significant student loan debt, consumer debt, and housing costs on stagnant wages. They were told that education guaranteed stability, but many degrees no longer translate into economic security. The gap between effort and outcome has widened, and frustration is growing. Another reality that is rarely discussed openly is that institutions benefit from dividing men and women. When families weaken, reliance on external systems increases. When personal support structures collapse, state intervention expands. Women were encouraged to view the state as a protector, but the state is not a partner. It is a manager. It provides assistance with conditions, oversight, and control. What looks like help often comes with strings that tighten over time. As technology advances, new systems of identification, surveillance, and regulation are being introduced under the banner of safety and convenience, and digital identity systems, online verification requirements, and centralized financial controls are expanding rapidly. These systems do not distinguish between protection and restriction. They are designed to monitor, limit, and enforce compliance. Women who were conditioned to prioritize safety over autonomy often support these measures without recognizing the long term consequences. Men, by contrast, are increasingly building parallel systems. Informal networks, decentralized economies, skill based exchanges, and low visibility communities are growing quietly beneath the surface. These systems rely on trust, competence, and mutual benefit rather than credentials or institutional approval. Entry into these spaces is earned, not granted, and many women find themselves excluded not by policy, but by practical barriers they cannot easily overcome alone. As these parallel economies grow, the value of traditional credentials declines. Degrees, titles, and symbolic achievements carry less weight than tangible skills and reliability. Men who adapted early are thriving in these environments, while those who remain dependent on centralized systems are struggling. Women who are encouraged to align themselves with institutions rather than communities are often left without access to these alternatives. This shift has profound implications for relationships, family formation, and social cohesion. Women who once expected partnership and support now face a world where those expectations are no longer met. Appeals to fairness, rights, or entitlement carry little weight in decentralized systems that operate on utility and reciprocity. What matters is what you bring, not what you are owed. As economic pressure increases, more women are turning to highly visible, short term income strategies that carry long term consequences. Hard times are here. Jobs are disappearing fast. And if you lose yours, you could be homeless in a few months or even a few weeks. But it doesn't have to be that way. Check out Angry's Creator Academy and learn how to build your own online business using YouTube to grow it. And get the free creator blueprint when you sign up. The link's in description below. Go check it out now. These paths are often framed as empowering, but they rarely provide sustainable security. The earnings are uneven, the stigma is permanent, and the exit options are limited. Once a reputation is established, it cannot be undone. And many women underestimate how long these digital footprints last. Meanwhile, the state promotes these options because they are taxable, trackable, and controllable. What is regulated can be managed. What is managed can be leveraged. Women who enter these systems often find themselves with fewer choices over time, not more. When support dries up, there is nowhere to turn but back to the same institutions that created the dependency in the first place. The emotional toll of this reality is becoming increasingly visible. Online, we see more women expressing confusion, anger, and grief over a life that does not match what they were promised. Many are asking why dating feels impossible, why stability feels out of reach, and why the future feels so uncertain. The answers are uncomfortable because they challenge narratives that have been treated as unquestionable for decades. Men, having already made peace with withdrawal, are largely unmoved by these appeals. They learned through experience that engagement carried risk without reward, and disengagement brought peace and stability. Having rebuilt their lives around simplicity, autonomy, and self preservation, they see no incentive to return to systems that once punished them for participating. This is not a story of victory or defeat, but of consequence. Actions taken over generations have produced outcomes that cannot be reversed with slogans or policies. The social experiment that removed men from their traditional roles did not eliminate the need for those roles. It simply left them unfilled. Nature does not negotiate, and reality does not care about intentions. As we move deeper into this decade, the gap between expectation and reality is going to widen further. Automation and artificial intelligence are already replacing large segments of the workforce, particularly in roles disproportionately occupied by women. The state, already burdened by debt and demographic decline, is not equipped to absorb millions of newly dependent citizens. The math does not work. In this environment, resilience will matter more than ideology. Adaptability will matter more than credentials. Community will matter more than policy. Those who can build, fix, trade, and protect will fare better than those who rely on promises. Men understood this shift earlier because survival has always been their primary function. Women were shielded from this reality for too long, and now the shield is gone. What we are witnessing is the end of an era where comfort was mistaken for security. The systems that once buffered poor decisions are weakening, and the cost of miscalculation is rising. Women who were encouraged to reject interdependence are now facing the consequences of isolation in a world that is becoming harsher by the year. This is not about assigning blame for the sake of resentment. It is about understanding cause and effect. A society cannot remove half its population from meaningful participation without consequences. A culture cannot demonize its producers and expect abundance to continue. And individuals cannot ignore biology, economics, and human nature without eventually colliding with them. The tragedy is not that women are struggling. The tragedy is that many were never told the truth. They were told comforting stories instead of hard realities. They were told that systems would replace people, that time would wait, and that responsibility could be outsourced. Now, as those illusions collapse, the reckoning has begun. And this is only the beginning. To understand where this is heading, you have to understand what men learned over the last several decades. Men did not suddenly wake up one morning and decide to disengage from women in society. This was a gradual process driven by observation, pattern recognition, and repeated negative reinforcement. Men were taught through experience that their effort was rarely rewarded, that their intentions were frequently misinterpreted, and that their participation came with increasing risk and diminishing returns. Over time, the rational response was not confrontation, but withdrawal. Men began to notice that words and outcomes no longer matched. They were told to be vulnerable, but vulnerability was later used against them. They were told to communicate, but communication was often reframed as emotional labor they failed to perform correctly. They were told to respect boundaries, but boundaries were selectively enforced depending on convenience. After enough cycles of contradiction, men stopped listening to narratives and started trusting outcomes instead. This is where pattern recognition replaced idealism. Men stopped asking what they were supposed to believe and started asking what actually happens. They noticed that accountability flowed in one direction. They noticed that blame rarely attached to the decision makers. They noticed that systems designed to protect everyone somehow always assumed male guilt and female innocence by default. Once that realization settled in, engagement became optional rather than expected. As men withdrew, they did something else that is rarely acknowledged. They simplified. Men reduced their needs, cut unnecessary expenses, downsized their lifestyles, and focused on self sufficiency. Many realized that they did not need validation, approval, or status symbols to function. Peace, autonomy, and predictability became more valuable than attention or admiration. This internal shift is one of the most important and least discussed changes of the modern era. While men were simplifying, women were being encouraged to complicate their lives. The modern female path emphasized constant striving, constant comparison, and constant visibility. Social media amplified this pressure, turning everyday life into a performance. Status was no longer derived from stability or contribution, but from appearance, perception, and external affirmation. This created a fragile identity structure that depends heavily on feedback from others. When that feedback diminishes, the structure collapses. As men disengaged from offering attention, praise, and resources, many women experienced not just loneliness, but identity shock. They were told that independence would feel empowering, but instead, it often felt exhausting. They were told that self focus would bring fulfillment, but instead, it often brought anxiety. Without the stabilizing presence of long term partnership, many women found themselves emotionally and financially overextended. Another uncomfortable truth is that modern systems reward short term compliance over long term resilience. Women were encouraged to trust institutions because institutions promised protection. But institutions operate on incentives, not loyalty. They respond to metrics, budgets, and political pressure, not individual well being. When resources are scarce, support is rationed and priorities shift. Those who depend entirely on systems are always the most vulnerable when systems falter. Men understood this instinctively because they were never promised unconditional support. They were taught early that survival required competence and adaptability. Women, by contrast, were often shielded from this lesson, told instead that structures would adjust to meet their needs. That belief held as long as economic conditions were favorable. As those conditions deteriorate, the gap between expectation and reality widens rapidly. This is why we are seeing rising anxiety and despair among women, even in wealthy societies. The floor they assumed existed is giving way beneath them. Jobs that once provided independence are being automated or outsourced. Housing costs are consuming disproportionate portions of income. Healthcare expenses are rising. Retirement prospects are uncertain. The math no longer works for large numbers of people, especially those who delayed family formation and lack intergenerational support. In response to this pressure, many women seek explanations that preserve their sense of moral certainty. It feels safer to blame abstract forces than to examine long term consequences of collective choices. It feels easier to demand solutions than to adapt behavior. But reality does not respond to demands, it responds to leverage. Men, by stepping away, removed a critical source of leverage women once relied on without realizing it. Relationships are not just emotional arrangements, they are economic and social partnerships. When men stopped participating in those partnerships, women lost more than companionship. They lost shared resources, shared risk, shared labor, and shared protection. These losses are not immediately visible, but they accumulate over time. Eventually, the absence becomes impossible to ignore. The dating market is one of the clearest examples of this shift. Many women report that dating feels broken, transactional, or non existent. They experience endless messaging with no follow through, ghosting, or superficial interaction. What they often do not realize is that many men are no longer trying to win. They are filtering aggressively, disengaging early, or avoiding the process entirely. The scarcity women feel is not imaginary, it is structural. This scarcity has ripple effects. Without consistent male investment, many women are forced to shoulder all costs themselves. Without family formation, expenses are not shared. Without children, future support networks shrink. Without partnership, illness, aging, and economic shocks become more dangerous. These are not abstract concerns. They are practical realities that grow more severe with time. At the same time, public discourse continues to insist that women are more oppressed than ever, even as they hold more legal rights and institutional support than any generation in history. This contradiction creates cognitive dissonance. If rights are expanding, but outcomes are worsening, something fundamental is being misunderstood. The answer lies in the difference between formal rights and functional outcomes. Rights on paper do not guarantee stability in practice. Men learned long ago that rights mean little without enforcement and support. Women are now learning a similar lesson from the opposite direction. Legal equality does not replace biological reality, economic constraints, or human behavior. A system can promise fairness, but it cannot force attraction, commitment, or sacrifice. Those things arise from incentive and mutual benefit, not obligation. As men withdraw further, the burden on women increases. Tasks once shared must be handled alone. Emotional labor becomes internalized. Financial planning becomes more complex. Risk tolerance decreases because failure has fewer buffers. This creates a feedback loop where fear drives behavior, and fear based behavior often leads to worse outcomes. In this state, short term relief becomes more appealing than long term planning. This is where many women turn toward highly regulated, highly visible forms of income that promise quick returns. These paths are marketed as flexible and empowering, but they come with hidden costs. Income volatility, lack of upward mobility, reputational damage, and future exclusion from traditional roles are rarely emphasized. The system benefits because these activities are taxable, trackable, and easy to control. The individual absorbs the risk. Men observing this from the outside feel no responsibility to intervene. They see adults making choices within a framework they themselves rejected. They understand that stepping in would reattach them to a system that penalizes them for involvement. Having learned that rescue efforts are often met with resentment or exploitation, they choose distance instead. Compassion without boundaries is no longer on the table. Another shift that deserves attention is how trust has eroded. Trust is built through consistent behavior over time. When narratives change faster than reality, trust collapses. Men noticed that standards applied to them were fluid, often retroactive, and inconsistently enforced. They responded by minimizing exposure. Trust was replaced with verification. Assumptions were replaced with caution. This mindset extends beyond relationships into workplaces and communities. Men increasingly prefer environments where rules are clear, expectations are explicit, and accountability is mutual. Spaces that rely on ambiguity, emotional interpretation, or shifting norms are avoided. This further isolates women who depend on mixed gender cooperation to advance socially and professionally. As men create male only networks and invite only environments, women find themselves excluded not by discrimination, but by design. These spaces are built around shared experience, shared risk, and shared responsibility. Entry requires proof of competence and reliability, not self identification. For many women accustomed to institutional validation, this represents an unfamiliar and often insurmountable barrier. The result is a growing divide between centralized and decentralized systems. Centralized systems promise inclusion but deliver constraint. Decentralized systems demand contribution but offer autonomy. Men gravitate toward the latter because it aligns with survival instincts. Women, conditioned to trust the former, find themselves increasingly dependent on structures that are overstretched and impersonal. This divide will intensify as technology advances. Automation will eliminate many roles that depend on routine, compliance, and presentation. Roles that require adaptability, physical presence, and practical problem solving will persist. Men disproportionately occupy the latter, women disproportionately occupy the former. As the labor market shifts, so will economic power. The state is not prepared for the scale of dependency this creates. Aging populations, declining birth rates, and shrinking tax bases limit its capacity to provide support. Promises made in times of growth cannot be honored in times of contraction. When systems fail to deliver, those who relied on them suffer most. This is why we are seeing an increase in messaging that reframes dependence as empowerment and scarcity as choice. Language is being used to soften reality rather than address it. But language does not pay rent, build homes, or provide food. Eventually, material conditions override narrative. Men, having already adjusted their expectations downward, are less affected by this shift. They planned for scarcity. They built redundancy into their lives. They reduced reliance on external validation and centralized support. Women, encouraged to expand expectations indefinitely, now face the difficult task of recalibrating under pressure. None of this means that women are doomed or incapable of adaptation. It means that adaptation will require confronting uncomfortable truths and abandoning comforting myths. It will require recognizing that independence without interdependence is fragile. It will require rebuilding trust with individuals rather than outsourcing responsibility to systems. The hardest part of this transition is psychological. Admitting that a promised future will not materialize feels like failure, even when it is systemic. Grief, anger, and denial are natural responses. But remaining in denial prolongs suffering. Acceptance is not surrender. It is the first step toward realistic planning. Men reach this stage earlier because they had fewer illusions to lose. Women are reaching it now under far more pressure. The question is not whether this shift will happen, but how it will be navigated. Those who adapt quickly will find new forms of stability. Those who cling to narratives that no longer align with reality will struggle. As we move forward, the gap between those who understand these dynamics and those who do not will widen. Conversations like this are uncomfortable because they strip away moral cushioning. They force a confrontation with cause and effect. They challenge deeply held beliefs about fairness, entitlement, and protection. To see where this is ultimately going, it is necessary to understand how parallel economies form and why they are accelerating right now. Parallel economies do not emerge because people want rebellion or chaos. They emerge because existing systems stop serving the people who sustain them. When effort no longer produces proportional reward, people do not protest forever. They adapt. Men, having long understood that survival depends on adaptability, were the first to disengage from systems that punished competence and rewarded compliance without contribution. A parallel economy is not a shadowy conspiracy. It is simply an alternative structure built on trust, skills, and mutual benefit rather than credentials and permission. These systems prioritize results over appearance. They value discretion over visibility. They function quietly because visibility attracts regulation, and regulation attracts control. Men gravitate toward these environments because they reward reliability and discourage drama, ambiguity, and performative behavior. As centralized systems expand oversight in the name of safety and inclusion, parallel systems expand autonomy in the name of survival. The two are moving in opposite directions. One grows larger, slower, and more restrictive. The other grows smaller, faster, and more selective. Women, who were encouraged to believe that inclusion would always be guaranteed, often find themselves unprepared for systems that require proof rather than declaration. This is not about exclusion as punishment, it is about risk management. Men learned that association carries liability. In environments where accusation can be as damaging as guilt, discretion becomes essential. Parallel economies minimize exposure by limiting participation to those with established trust. This naturally favors long standing relationships, shared experience, and demonstrable competence, all areas where men tend to have denser networks. Women encountering these systems often mistake silence for hostility. In reality, silence is protection. These networks are not designed to accommodate uncertainty or emotional volatility. They are designed to function under pressure. Entry requires contribution, not need. For those accustomed to institutional accommodation, this feels harsh. But for those who built these systems, it is necessary. As these parallel structures mature, they begin to replace functions once handled by centralized institutions. Housing arrangements, skill exchanges, transportation solutions, and informal healthcare networks emerge organically. These are not ideological projects. They are practical responses to rising costs, declining trust, and increasing regulation. Men participate because participation yields tangible benefit without ideological overhead. Women who lack access to these systems become increasingly dependent on centralized support. This dependence grows as traditional career paths become less reliable. Automation disproportionately affects roles centered on administration, coordination, and presentation. Roles requiring physical presence, technical skill, and improvisation are harder to replace. Men are overrepresented in the latter. Women are overrepresented in the former. As automation advances, the gap widens. Centralized systems respond by offering retraining, subsidies, and expanded oversight. These measures provide temporary relief but increase long term dependency. Each layer of assistance comes with additional conditions. Each safeguard adds friction. Over time, autonomy erodes while surveillance increases. The system becomes less forgiving as resources tighten. Women, having been encouraged to prioritize safety over freedom, often support these expansions without recognizing their cumulative impact. Men, having learned to distrust systems that grow by restriction, move further away. This divergence deepens social fragmentation. Shared norms dissolve. Shared experiences disappear. The social fabric thins. This fragmentation affects relationships at every level. Dating becomes transactional. Work becomes adversarial. Community becomes abstract. Without shared incentives, cooperation declines. Women feel abandoned. Men feel relieved. Both experience loss, but in different ways. Women lose support they assumed was permanent. Men lose connection they learned was conditional. As trust declines, communication deteriorates. Words lose meaning when they are repeatedly contradicted by action. Men respond by prioritizing observable behavior over stated intention. Women, accustomed to being believed, struggle with this shift. When words no longer carry weight, leverage evaporates. Influence must then come from contribution, not assertion. This is why appeals to empathy increasingly fail. Empathy requires trust. Trust requires consistency. Where consistency is absent, distance replaces engagement. Men are not moved by emotional appeals that do not align with observed patterns. They are not persuaded by narratives that absolve responsibility while demanding support. They have learned that participation without boundaries is a liability. The psychological impact of this realization cannot be overstated. Men who disengage report reduced stress, improved financial stability, and increased sense of control. Their lives become quieter, more predictable, and more self directed. Women observing this often interpret it as indifference or cruelty. In reality, it is self preservation. Women, meanwhile, face increasing pressure to perform resilience while lacking structural support. They are told to adapt, but adaptation is framed as personal failure rather than systemic misalignment. This creates internal conflict. The message is that empowerment exists, but only if outcomes improve. When outcomes worsen, the individual is blamed. This blame dynamic intensifies as economic conditions deteriorate. Rising costs and shrinking opportunities create competition where cooperation once existed. Women compete with each other for limited resources. Support networks fracture under strain. Without male buffering, conflict becomes more visible and more personal. Social cohesion erodes. Men are aware of this dynamic and avoid environments where conflict is unmanaged. They seek spaces with clear hierarchies, defined roles, and enforceable norms. These spaces are often male dominated not by intention but by function. Women who enter must adapt to the culture rather than reshape it. Many are unwilling or unable to do so. This leads to a further concentration of male cooperation and female isolation. The feedback loop accelerates. Men benefit from shared knowledge and pooled resources. Women rely increasingly on external support that is limited and conditional. The disparity grows not because of malice, but because of alignment with reality. As this process continues, cultural narratives shift to manage dissonance. Failure is reframed as choice. Scarcity is reframed as liberation. Dependency is reframed as empowerment. These reframings soothe anxiety but do not solve problems. Over time, the gap between narrative and experience becomes unbearable. When that gap collapses, people seek meaning and blame. Some blame men, some blame institutions, some blame abstract forces. Rarely do they examine incentives. Rarely do they question assumptions. But systems respond to incentives, not intentions. Behavior follows reward. Where reward disappears, behavior changes. Men understood this earlier because reward structures turned against them first. Women are now encountering the same reality from a different angle. The systems they trusted are overextended. The protections they relied on are conditional. The future they were promised is no longer guaranteed. This does not mean that cooperation between men and women is impossible. It means that it will look very different from what many expected. It will be smaller, more selective, and more grounded in mutual benefit. It will prioritize stability over spectacle. It will favor long term thinking over short term gratification. For women, adapting to this reality requires rebuilding trust through consistency, contribution, and accountability. It requires accepting that attraction and commitment cannot be legislated. It requires understanding that protection is not a right, but a reciprocal arrangement. These lessons are difficult because they contradict decades of messaging. For men, the challenge is resisting cynicism. Withdrawal protects, but it also isolates. The danger is becoming so focused on avoidance that opportunity is lost. Balance requires discernment rather than disengagement. Not all cooperation is risk. Not all participation is exploitation. The skill lies in knowing the difference. As we move deeper into this transition, those who understand these dynamics will fare better than those who cling to outdated narratives. The world is becoming less forgiving, not because it is cruel, but because it is constrained. Resources are finite. Trust is scarce. Stability must be built, not assumed. The coming years will test adaptability across the board. Economic contraction, technological disruption, and demographic decline will strain every system. Those who rely on centralized support will feel the strain first. Those who built redundancy will weather it better. This is not ideology, it is logistics. Women who recognize this early can still reposition. Skills can be developed, expectations can be recalibrated, communities can be rebuilt on realistic terms. But this requires abandoning the belief that outcomes will improve without behavioral change. Hope without adjustment is not a strategy. Men, having already adjusted, will continue refining their systems. They will become more selective, more private, and more focused on sustainability. Their withdrawal is not temporary, it is adaptive. Any future reintegration will be conditional on trust, not demand. The most difficult truth in all of this is that no authority can force reconciliation. Laws can regulate behavior, but they cannot manufacture goodwill. Policies can redistribute resources, but they cannot create attraction or loyalty. Social cohesion emerges organically from aligned incentives, not coercion. As these realities become harder to ignore, tension will rise. Some will demand intervention, others will retreat further. The outcome will depend on whether individuals choose adaptation over denial. History shows that denial delays recovery, but adaptation enables survival. As these structural shifts deepen, the most profound changes are happening internally in how people understand themselves and their place in the world. Identity, which was once anchored in family roles, community contribution, and shared responsibility, has increasingly been outsourced to labels, ideologies, and external validation. When those external structures begin to fail, the identity built on them weakens as well. This is especially destabilizing for people who were encouraged to define themselves primarily through social approval rather than internal competence. For many women, identity was framed around limitless potential without clear boundaries. The message was that they could be anything at any time without trade offs. That framing feels empowering early on, but it becomes destabilizing later because it removes the concept of prioritization. When everything is possible, nothing is chosen with urgency. Time passes quietly until it no longer feels abundant. And then the absence of structure becomes a source of anxiety rather than freedom. Men, by contrast, were never offered that illusion. Their identity formation was constrained by expectations of utility and performance. While this was often criticized as oppressive, it had a stabilizing effect. Men learned early that value had to be demonstrated, not declared. As harsh as that lesson can be, it creates a clear feedback loop between effort and outcome. When systems stopped rewarding that effort, men adjusted by redirecting it elsewhere. This difference in identity formation explains much so of the current disconnect. Women were encouraged to prioritize self expression, while men were encouraged to prioritize function. When resources are plentiful, self expression feels sustainable. When resources tighten, function becomes essential. The environment now favors the latter, and identities built around the former struggle to adapt. Family formation sits at the center of this crisis. Families are not just emotional units, they are economic and psychological stabilizers. They distribute risk, provide long term purpose, and create continuity across generations. When family formation declines, individuals bear the full weight of uncertainty alone. This increases stress, reduces resilience, and amplifies the impact of economic shocks. Women who delayed or avoided family formation were told they were gaining freedom. What many are discovering is that they traded one form of dependency for another. Instead of depending on a partner and extended family, they depend on employers, landlords, and institutions. These entities do not provide unconditional support. Their relationship is transactional and terminates when utility ends. As people age, this reality becomes more pronounced. Youth provides flexibility, energy, and social visibility. As those fade, stability becomes more important. Those who invested early in durable relationships and shared responsibility have buffers. Those who did not must navigate aging alone in systems that prioritize efficiency over care. Men recognized this risk earlier and responded by minimizing obligations and maximizing control. They accepted solitude as a trade off for autonomy. Women who were told that solitude was strength are now discovering that prolonged isolation erodes well being. Humans are not designed to thrive indefinitely without deep connection and shared purpose. This erosion is visible in rising reports of anxiety, depression, and emotional exhaustion. These are not personal failures, they are symptoms of structural misalignment. When the environment demands resilience without providing support, strain accumulates. When identity is built on narratives rather than outcomes, disillusionment follows. The conversation around empowerment often avoids discussing responsibility. Empowerment without responsibility is fragile because it lacks grounding. Responsibility forces prioritization. It demands trade offs. It anchors identity in action rather than aspiration. Men were burdened with responsibility early and often resented it. Women were shielded from it and encouraged to defer it. Now, responsibility is unavoidable for everyone. As systems contract, they externalize risk onto individuals. Benefits are reduced. Support is conditional. Compliance increases. Those who lack personal support networks feel this pressure most acutely. Women who relied on institutional promises are now facing the limits of those promises. This is why messaging around self care and self love has exploded. These concepts offer comfort in the absence of structural support. They are coping mechanisms rather than solutions. While rest and reflection are important, they do not replace economic security, community, or shared purpose. Without addressing root causes, they function as temporary relief. Men, having already internalized the need for self reliance, are less drawn to these narratives. Their coping strategies are practical rather than symbolic. They focus on skill acquisition, resource management, and environmental control. These strategies are not glamorous, but they are effective. As this divergence continues, misunderstandings multiply. Women may interpret male withdrawal as hostility. Men may interpret female frustration as entitlement. Both interpretations miss the underlying issue, which is misaligned incentives and unmet expectations. Blame obscures analysis. Analysis enables adaptation. The future of cooperation depends on recalibrating expectations. That means acknowledging that no system can replace interpersonal trust and mutual responsibility. It means accepting that freedom comes with trade offs and that safety without autonomy is not sustainable. It means recognizing that equality of rights does not guarantee equality of outcomes, especially in a constrained environment. Younger generations are already absorbing these lessons differently. Many young men are opting out earlier. Having observed the outcomes of previous generations, they are cautious, selective, and focused on self development. Many young women are confused, having been promised a path that no longer aligns with reality. This generational gap will shape culture for decades. Education systems have not adjusted to this shift. They continue to promote outdated narratives about success and fulfillment. Degrees are marketed as guarantees rather than tools. Careers are framed as identities rather than means. When reality diverges, graduates are left disoriented and indebted. Men increasingly bypass formal education in favor of direct skill acquisition. Women continue to pursue credentials in fields with limited demand. This divergence compounds economic disparity. When debt meets declining opportunity, dependency increases. The psychological impact of dependency is profound. It reduces agency, increases anxiety, and fosters resentment. People who feel trapped seek someone to blame. Narratives that assign blame externally gain traction because they protect self image, but they also prevent learning. Men who disengaged learned through failure. Women who were protected from failure are now encountering it at scale. The difference is timing and support. Learning late is harder because the margin for error is smaller. This increases emotional intensity and reduces patience. As pressure builds, calls for intervention will grow louder. Policies will be proposed to restore balance. Some may provide temporary relief. Few will address root causes. Structural problems cannot be solved by decree. They require realignment of incentives and behavior. One of the most difficult adjustments for women will be accepting that attraction and commitment cannot be negotiated through moral framing. They are emergent properties of behavior, competence, and trust. Demanding outcomes without addressing inputs leads to frustration. For men, the challenge will be resisting total disengagement. While withdrawal offers protection, it also limits opportunity for meaningful connection. The goal is not isolation, but discernment. Learning when and where to engage is more valuable than blanket avoidance. As parallel economies expand, they will influence culture indirectly. Values like reliability, discretion, and contribution will regain importance. Visibility will be replaced by reputation. Noise will give way to signal. Those who adapt to the shift will find stability even in contraction. Women who can align with these values will find pathways back into cooperative systems. Those who cannot will remain dependent on centralized support that continues to shrink. The difference will not be ideological, but practical. The coming years will be defined by recalibration. Expectations formed in abundance must adjust to scarcity. Identities built on promise must ground themselves in reality. Systems built on expansion must learn to function under constraint. This is not a collapse in the dramatic sense. It is a quiet reordering. Those paying attention will adapt. Those clinging to old narratives will struggle. The world will not pause to accommodate confusion. When trust collapses, it does not disappear all at once. It erodes gradually through small contradictions, unmet expectations, and repeated disappointments. By the time people realize trust is gone, they are already operating in defensive mode. This is where society is now. Men and women are no longer interacting from a place of assumed goodwill, but from a place of risk assessment. Every interaction is filtered through caution, and caution fundamentally alters behavior. Trust cannot be rebuilt through slogans, campaigns, or mandates. It can only be rebuilt through consistent behavior over time. That is the part many people do not want to hear, because consistency requires discipline, humility, and accountability. It requires people to accept that intentions do not matter as much as outcomes. This is especially difficult in a culture that has prioritized self expression over self regulation. For women, rebuilding trust requires confronting the reality that credibility is earned, not granted. Decades of being believed by default created an expectation that words alone should be sufficient. But when words are repeatedly contradicted by action, credibility declines. This does not mean women must remain silent. It means speech must align with behavior if it is to carry weight again. Men learned this lesson the hard way. They learned that promises are meaningless without follow through, and that reputation is built slowly but destroyed quickly. As a result, many men now communicate less but act more. They prefer environments where behavior speaks louder than declarations. This preference will shape future cooperation more than ideology ever could. The rebuilding of trust also requires redefining fairness. Fairness does not mean identical outcomes. It means consistent rules and predictable consequences. Men disengaged because rules became fluid and consequences became asymmetrical. Women will continue to struggle until this asymmetry is acknowledged and corrected, not rhetorically, but structurally. Another obstacle to trust is the fear of vulnerability. Vulnerability is only safe when trust exists. Without it, vulnerability becomes exposure. Many women still expect emotional openness without providing reciprocal security. Many men refuse vulnerability altogether because they learned it carries risk without protection. Until vulnerability is mutual and safeguarded, emotional distance will persist. This is why future cooperation will be narrower but deeper. Fewer relationships and fewer partnerships, but greater stability within those that exist. Broad social trust is unlikely to return quickly. Instead, trust will be localized within small networks where behavior can be observed directly. This favors communities over institutions and relationships over abstractions. Family formation, if it recovers at all, will look different. It will be slower, more deliberate, and more conditional. Men will not commit early or easily. Women will need to demonstrate reliability rather than assume entitlement. The romantic ideal of spontaneous connection will give way to pragmatic alignment. This may feel cold, but it is adaptive. Economic cooperation will follow a similar pattern. Informal partnerships will replace formal hierarchies. Skill based collaboration will replace credential based access. Those who can contribute tangibly will find opportunities. Those who cannot will be sidelined regardless of intent or narrative. This shift will be painful for many because it strips away symbolic validation. Titles, labels, and social approval will matter less than outcomes. People accustomed to being recognized for potential rather than performance will struggle. But performance based systems are more resilient under pressure, which is why they are emerging now. Women who adapt to this environment will do so by embracing responsibility earlier rather than later. This means developing practical skills, managing finances conservatively, and prioritizing long term stability over short term gratification. It means choosing reliability over excitement and contribution over consumption. These choices are not glamorous, but they are effective. Men who re enter cooperation will do so cautiously. They will look for consistency, humility, and accountability. They will avoid environments that reward chaos or emotional volatility. This is not cruelty, it is pattern recognition. Once burned, people do not return to the fire willingly. The media narrative will lag behind reality. It always does. Stories of empowerment and liberation will continue even as material conditions worsen. This creates confusion and resentment. People sense that something is wrong, but are told they are more free than ever. The dissonance grows. Eventually, lived experience overrides narrative. When bills cannot be paid, when health declines, when isolation becomes unbearable, ideology loses its hold. Reality forces recalibration, whether people are ready or not. Those who recalibrate early suffer less. Another critical factor in rebuilding trust is honesty about limits. No one can have everything. Trade offs are unavoidable. A culture that denies trade offs produces fragile individuals. Men learn to accept limits early. Women are being forced to accept them now. Acceptance is painful, but it is stabilizing. There's also a generational dimension to this shift. Younger men are growing up watching older men disengage and thrive in simplicity. They are absorbing lessons without direct experience. Younger women are growing up watching older women struggle despite following prescribed paths. They are confused, not rebellious. Confusion breeds anxiety. Education systems have not adapted to address this confusion. They continue to promote outdated success models. This leaves young people ill prepared for reality. Men self educate through experience and peer networks. Women are more likely to trust formal guidance that no longer aligns with outcomes. As a result, adaptation among women will be uneven. Some will pivot quickly, building skills and seeking stable partnerships. Others will double down on narratives that promise rescue without change. The latter group will suffer most as conditions tighten. Trust rebuilding also requires time. There is no shortcut. Years of misalignment cannot be undone by a few good interactions. Men will watch behavior over long periods before re engaging. Women will need patience they were never encouraged to cultivate. This asymmetry will frustrate both sides. The broader social impact of this slow rebuilding will be increased fragmentation. Smaller, tighter communities will form around shared values and behaviors. Large scale cohesion will remain weak. This is not inherently negative. Smaller systems are often more resilient, but it does mean fewer safety nets for those outside them. Women who find themselves excluded from these communities will feel abandoned. But abandonment implies obligation. Men no longer feel obligated to provide support without reciprocity. Obligation without consent breeds resentment. Consent based cooperation is the only sustainable model going forward. This is why moral appeals will continue to fail. Morality without mutual benefit is unsustainable. People act in alignment with incentives. Changing behavior requires changing incentives, not scolding or shaming. Men learn to ignore shame because it was used indiscriminately. Women will need to learn that shame no longer moves men. The future will reward clarity, clear expectations, clear boundaries, clear consequences. Ambiguity favors manipulation and conflict. Men avoid ambiguity. Women who continue to rely on it will find themselves increasingly isolated. As systems contract, personal responsibility expands. There will be fewer excuses and fewer buffers. This is not because society has become cruel, but because it has become constrained. Constraint forces efficiency. Efficiency eliminates excess. The most difficult adjustment for many women will be letting go of the belief that the world owes them understanding. Understanding does not pay costs. Cooperation does. Contribution does. Reliability does. These are the currencies of the future. Men, having already adopted this mindset, will continue refining it. They will invest in themselves, their skills, and their chosen communities. They will remain skeptical of broad appeals and focus on tangible outcomes. Their peace will come from control rather than approval. Women who can align with this reality will find new forms of fulfillment. It will not look like the promised dream. It will be quieter, smaller, and more grounded, but it will be real. Those who cannot align will remain trapped between narrative and necessity. The rebuilding of trust between men and women is possible, but it will not resemble the past. It will be conditional, deliberate, and based on mutual benefit rather than assumption. It will require humility on both sides, but especially from those who were promised more than reality could deliver. As we approach the final stages of this discussion, the central question becomes unavoidable. What happens if adaptation does not occur at scale? What happens if denial persists longer than resources allow? History provides an answer, and it is not comforting. In periods of prolonged misalignment, societies fragment, individuals retreat into smaller units. Conflict increases not through violence, but through neglect. People fall through gaps that no longer have nets. Survival becomes individualized rather than communal. Men are already positioned for this reality. Women, broadly speaking, are not. This does not make women weak. It means they were prepared for a different world than the one that is emerging. Preparation matters more than intention. The coming decade will be defined by adjustment or collapse at the personal level. Those who adjust will survive and even thrive in constrained conditions. Those who wait for rescue will find none. The state cannot replace personal networks indefinitely. Systems cannot compensate for broken incentives forever. This is not a call for panic. It is a call for realism. Panic paralyzes, realism empowers. Seeing the world as it is allows people to act effectively within it. At this point, the shape of the future should be clear, even if the details remain uncertain. What lies ahead is not a sudden collapse or dramatic turning point, but a long process of sorting, separating, and recalibrating. Societies do not usually break all at once, they thin out. The strong connections hold, the weak ones dissolve, and the assumptions that once felt permanent quietly disappear. What remains is not what people hope for, but what still functions. The most important realization for anyone watching this unfold is that adaptation is no longer optional. It is not something to consider later after conditions improve. Conditions are not improving, they are tightening. The margin for error is shrinking, and the cost of denial is rising. Waiting for the world to return to a familiar version of the past is no longer realistic. That world was built on conditions that no longer exist. For women, the path forward begins with clarity rather than comfort. It begins with understanding that institutional promises are limited, conditional, and subject to change. It begins with recognizing that long term security has always come from relationships, skills, and shared responsibility rather than titles, narratives, or external validation. This does not mean abandoning ambition or independence, it means grounding them in reality. Practical adaptation means prioritizing stability over image. It means choosing competence over performance, consistency over excitement, and long term planning over short term relief. It means building skills that solve real problems, managing finances conservatively, and cultivating relationships that are reciprocal rather than extractive. These are not glamorous choices, but they are the choices that endure. It also means reassessing expectations around relationships. Partnership is not guaranteed, and commitment is not owed. It emerges when both sides see clear benefit and shared direction. Expecting rescue without contribution is no longer viable. Expecting trust without accountability is no longer realistic. Relationships that do form in this environment will be fewer but stronger because they will be based on alignment rather than assumption. And for men, the challenge going forward is balance. Withdrawal provided protection and peace, but total disengagement carries its own cost. A life built entirely around avoidance can become narrow and brittle. Discernment is more valuable than isolation. Knowing when to engage, where to engage, and with whom to engage allows for connection without exposure to unnecessary risk. Men who choose to re engage selectively will do so with clearer boundaries, higher standards, and greater patience. They will prioritize behavior over words, consistency over charm, and reliability over intensity. This is not punishment, it is adaptation. Once learned, these lessons are rarely unlearned. At the societal level, the divide between centralized systems and decentralized networks will continue to widen. Large institutions will struggle under the weight of demographic decline, automation, and fiscal pressure. They will respond with more regulation, more oversight, and more messaging. Parallel systems will continue to grow quietly, offering autonomy to those who can contribute and adapt. Neither system is inherently good or evil. They serve different needs and attract different people. The danger lies in assuming one can replace the other. Centralized systems can provide baseline support, but they cannot create meaning, trust, or loyalty. Decentralized systems can foster resilience, but they require effort, accountability, and personal investment. People who understand this distinction will navigate the future more effectively. Those who cling to one system while rejecting the reality of the other will experience frustration and decline. Balance, once again, is the key. The cultural narratives that dominated the last several decades are losing their power because they no longer align with lived experience. When narratives fail, people either adapt or radicalize. Adaptation is quieter and less visible. Radicalization is louder and more dramatic. The latter gets more attention, but the former determines outcomes. Most people do not want conflict. They want stability, predictability, and a sense of control over their lives. When those things are unavailable, anxiety rises and trust falls. Rebuilding trust starts at the individual level, not the institutional one. It starts with keeping promises, honoring boundaries, and accepting responsibility for choices made. One of the most damaging myths of the modern era was the idea that comfort could replace resilience. Comfort is pleasant, but it does not prepare people for difficulty. Resilience is built through responsibility, repetition, and restraint. Men were forced to learn this early. Women were often shielded from it. That shield is gone now, and the adjustment is painful, but necessary. Another myth was that freedom meant the absence of obligation. In reality, freedom without obligation leads to fragility. Obligation creates structure, structure creates stability. Stability allows freedom to be sustained over time. This is not a popular message, but it is a true one. The future will not reward those who demand fairness in abstract terms. It will reward those who create value, build trust, and align with reality. This applies to everyone, regardless of gender. The difference is that some groups were prepared for this environment earlier than others, and there is still time for meaningful adjustment. Skills can be learned, habits can be changed, expectations can be recalibrated, communities can be rebuilt on more honest terms, but time is not unlimited and delay carries cost. The longer people wait to adapt, the harder adaptation becomes. This is not a message of doom, it is a message of transition. Every transition feels like loss to those who benefited from the old system. It feels like opportunity to those who were constrained by it. Most people fall somewhere in between, uncertain and cautious, and the path forward is narrower than it once was, but it is still navigable. It requires humility rather than entitlement, realism rather than fantasy, and effort rather than slogans. It requires letting go of comforting lies and replacing them with workable truths. Men walking away was never about revenge or cruelty. It was about survival and sanity. It was about refusing to participate in systems that punished contribution and rewarded chaos. That decision has reshaped the social landscape in ways many did not anticipate, but it was not irrational. It was adaptive. Women now face their own adaptive moment. Not all will succeed, not all will fail. Outcomes will vary based on choices made from this point forward. The era of automatic outcomes is over. The era of consequence has arrived. What happens next will not be decided by speeches, protests, or policies alone. It will be decided by millions of quiet individual decisions made every day. Decisions about how to spend time, how to manage resources, how to treat others, and how to prepare for an uncertain future. Those who take responsibility will find a way forward. Those who wait for permission will struggle. That is not ideology. That is reality. If there is one thing to take away from this entire discussion, it is this: no one is coming to save you. Not the state, not the market, not culture. Stability is built from the ground up, not delivered from the top down. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree? Do you disagree? And why? Leave a comment and share your thoughts, because these conversations matter and because silence does not change outcomes. Like the video if you like it. Do not forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video, and just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.